Hello, this is Matthew Welch. It's February 7th, 2022, and this is going to be my presentation for week 3, and we're going to be discussing the peripheral sensory receptors along with how they integrate with the central nervous system. So let's go ahead and get started. There are 4 major types of sensory receptors, 4 major classes. Each one of these classes of receptors is going to have kind of subclasses of neurons that are specialized in detecting different kinds of stimuli within these certain categories. But these are the broader categories, and we'll go over some of the different types of the subcategories as well. But our first one's going to be chemoreceptors, and these receptors respond to chemical ligands with things like gases in the body, such as oxygen, pH levels, and organic molecules, such as things like glucose when we talk about blood sugar regulation. Chemoreceptors aid in maintaining homeostasis in the body through a lot of processes that we're not consciously aware of that just happen. And the next class is going to be mechanoreceptors, and these receptors respond to stimuli from mechanical energy. These are things such as pressure, stretching, vibration. So an example of some of these would be vibration of the inner ear hairs, as well as pressure on from external environments like on the skin. And stretch receptors that we have located in specialized areas such as blood vessels and the bladder and areas like that. The next class is going to be thermoreceptors, and these receptors are responsible for managing the temperature of the body and respond to varying degrees of heat. And finally, photoreceptors are specialized receptors that respond to light photons, and these are responsible for our vision. So as you can see, these 4 major types have a lot of specialized neurons within them that you can go into more detail if we had more time, but that just gives you a general overview. Some more information about sensory neurons and receptors that we should understand is that these are responsible for a process called transduction. This is where a stimulus, regardless of the type, whether it would be a pressure stimulus or a temperature stimulus or a chemical stimulus, is changed into a nervous system impulse to be generated. All of these sensory receptors and neurons rely on the stimulus in order to activate them. Most receptors are more responsive to a particular kind of stimulus. For example, light receptors or photoreceptors in the eye are most responsive to light, but there are other ways that those can be activated. For example, if you're hit in the eye, you might see white or see stars. So even though it wasn't from light, it was from pressure, those receptors are still activated. However, they work better when they are activated by their primary stimulus. All of these receptors also have a threshold. That's very important to understand, that the stimulus has to be at a certain threshold in order to activate an action potential, which will generate an impulse and travel up the axon towards its final destination. Excuse me. And these action potentials are accomplished by the opening and closing of ion channels and the flux of ions either in or out of the cell membrane in order to take that resting membrane potential and turn it into an action potential. So as you can see down there in the right-hand corner, we have a small little chart of what shows an action potential process where we're at a negative 70 millivolt resting state. there's a stimulus. And if you look here, well, I thought this is interesting because you can tell where there was two stimulus that failed to reach the threshold level. Once that stimulus did reach the threshold level, we had depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, and then the return to the resting state. So important to remember here is that there is a stimulus threshold that must be achieved in order for that action potential to take place. Then the job of these peripheral sensory receptor neurons is to send information to the central nervous system for processing. So once these action potentials are generated with via an adequate stimulus threshold, they travel down the axon towards the spinal cord through what are called first-order neurons, and then they begin to travel via the ascending pathways up towards the brain. There are some information or some impulses that remain at the level of the spinal cord or the brain stem and don't go any further. These are things that we don't consciously have to think about: changes in blood pressure, changes in metabolic states, reaction to different pHs. These are all done via the central nervous system, but not at a conscious level. So not everything has to be sent all the way up through the second and third order neurons to be processed. But the information that is needing to make it towards the cerebellum travels to the thalamus, where via the second order neuron, the thalamus is responsible for relaying that impulse to the proper area of the cerebellum. And that's accomplished through the third order neurons that would carry information from the thalamus to the proper area for processing. And that's represented down here in this picture we have here, where you can see everything being relayed towards the thalamus, and then the thalamus taking in information and directing it where it needs to go. Again, the central nervous system is responsible for gathering this information and creating a response, or not creating a response to it as needed. There is a concept known as perceptual threshold, and perceptual threshold means that the intensity level of a stimulus needs to be at a certain level for us to be aware of it. A good example of this would be if you have your TV on at the same time you are studying and you're focusing on studying, your nervous system will eventually kind of fade out any processing of what is being said or seen on the TV because you're not paying attention to it. So even though the stimulus is still there and it's enough to create the impulse, you're not reacting to it. So that's an example of a perceptual threshold. There are four things the CNS needs to do or determine from receiving an impulse. And the first is modality, and that is the nature of the impulse. So is it a temperature impulse? Is it a pain impulse? And this can be accomplished through something called labeled line coding. And this means that when the central nervous system receives an impulse from a set of neuron, it's going to receive and interpret that impulse as what that neuron is for. For example, if you have cold receptors and you use menthol, even though it's not cold, your body interprets it as cold because it's activating those receptors. So it's a one-for-one system that allows the central nervous system to quickly interpret the modality of those impulses. The next is going to be location. This is based off of the receptive field of activation. These sensory neurons have a receptive field. Some are small, some are big. Some work through convergence to take large areas and funnel them down through one neural pathway. But the whole point there is the CNS needs to determine where this impulse is coming from. And that can be accomplished through something known as lateral inhibition, where, for example, in the skin, where you are receiving a stimulus, while that receptor is being activated, it actually inactivates the ones around it. So the central nervous system can focus more on where exactly it's coming from, allows for that quicker and more accurate identification location. Intensity, this is determined by the number of receptors activated and the frequency of the action potentials that are being sent. And this is known as population and frequency coding. Population meaning the higher the intensity level of the stimuli, the more receptors that are going to be activated, and the easier your body's going to be able to determine what that signal is. And frequency coding is, again, the higher the level of the stimulus, the more action potentials that are generated and the quicker they're generated. And again, the central nervous system is able to then take those two factors and determine the intensity of a stimuli. And then the duration is fairly straightforward. As long as the action potential is being generated, the central nervous system is going to receive that and interpret it. Like we mentioned before, some of these are going to go all the way up to the somatic cortex in the brain, while some of these impulses will not. The ones that do make it, again, come from the thalamus and are sent to the cerebellum and the primary somatic sensory cortex from the third order neurons. And the greater the sensitivity of the area, the larger the area the cortex has. As you can see here, you have this diagram showing the primary somatic cortex and the different portions of the cortex that are dedicated to different somatic receptor neurons that are coming in. So the more detailed and the greater sensitivity, the larger portion of the sensory cortex that is going to take up. And interesting about the somatic cortex is that it is not, the regions are not fixed, they can change. So, for example, somebody who loses a limb will, let's say, our toes may have that area of the actual cortex and the tissue decrease in size, while somebody who is blind and uses their fingers more often and no longer uses their sight could see this area here of the somatic cortex actually increase in size. That's the body's way of adapting to these changes. And lastly, we have our references that were used. The photos were cited on the slides. So we covered the 4 major types of receptors, kind of how the sensory neurons work, just a quick overview, how they're integrated with the central nervous system, and some of the different processes the central nervous system uses to determine what an impulse is and what to do with it, and also where to send that impulse or how far up the order of neurons that impulse goes before a reaction is made. So attached to this is a post-test, 10-question post-test that goes over some of the information that we discussed here today, and you'll find the answers on that post-test as well. So thank you very much and have a good day.